All right, we're ready and love your Bible for 1 Samuel. The author of the two books of Samuel, believe it or not, is unknown. We think Samuel wrote about his own life and the reign of King Saul, Israel's first king. But the books contain so much detailed personal information that it seems probable the author had access to very detailed records that we know existed. For instance, in 1 Chronicles about this era, we read all the events of King David's reign from beginning to end are written in at least 3 of these other books. So the author had access to more information. And certainly Samuel didn't write about his own death. So we think Samuel wrote most all of 1st and 2nd Samuel, but maybe not all of it. Now Samuel's an interesting man because we've been studying the Judges. 2 weeks ago we studied the book of Judges, and last week we studied the book of Ruth, which takes place during the time of the Judges. Samuel was considered by nearly all scholars as the last of the judges and the first of the prophets. Samuel was the one who placed Israel's first king on the throne, Saul, and he anointed, when he was still a teenage boy, the second king, David. We'll see that today. As the book of 1 Samuel begins, again, there is no Samuel. Central government and a central army is all Israel has. The nation has been a group of families or tribes who come together for worships or festivals, but they've never had a king. God has been their king, and they've been ruled for quite some time now, a couple of hundred years, by judges. And so these traveling judges would settle disputes among the people. God would give the judges messages from time to time, as we talked about 2 weeks ago. And it was a dark moment, actually, in Israel's history. And so they were not a typical nation. And as the book begins, Eli, who is now the high priest over the Jews, is the nation's spiritual leader. Samuel, whom Eli has raised to succeed him as the next spiritual leader and a prophet of God, is highly respected and loved and godly, a deeply spiritual man. And the story of Samuel himself begins with a very interesting little passage in the first chapter of 1 Samuel. There was a man named Elkanah who lived in Ramah. He was the son of Jeroboam. He had 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. All right, we start there with an obviously strained and stressed situation. This man had 2 wives, one had a child, one didn't. Mark Twain was once challenged by a polygamous Mormon to quote a Bible verse prohibiting bigamy. And he said, "That's easy. No man can serve 2 masters." God's ideal was 1 man, 1 woman, lifetime relationship. God tolerated polygamy in that time as he tolerates divorce today, but it was never, ever his intention. And Peninnah, who had a child, would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord had kept her from having children. So you can just see this scene playing out and how that made Hannah feel. Peninnah would brag about her children in front of Hannah and then make a comment, "Oh, how about your kids, Hannah? Oops, I forgot." And I'm sure it was all poor Hannah could do, who wanted a child so badly, to keep from slapping Peninnah in the face. Hannah, you see, could steer clear of Peninnah around the house. She lived a separate life. I'm sure the wives weren't the best of friends. Her daily routine avoided contact with her rival, but twice a year they had to share a common space when Elkanah's entire family would travel for the religious festivals and feasts, and particularly when they made the pilgrimage to Shiloh, where they would worship God actually at the tabernacle, the tent. So she could have stayed home, but she knew that was an option that wouldn't be acceptable to God. And let me just pull over there and park for just a second and say there's a lesson for all of us there. We are all liable at some time or another to meet a Peninnah at God's house. People at church can get jealous of your fruitfulness, just like Hannah was jealous of Peninnah and Peninnah rubbed it in. People can sometimes be a source of irritation and aggravation, and the temptation can be just avoid them. Just stay home. Don't ever let a Peninnah rob you of the will of God and the fellowship of God and the encouragement of meeting with God's people. So Hannah keeps begging in prayer God for a baby boy, and she makes, in chapter 1, a twofold vow. She says if God answers her request, she'll see to it that the boy serves the Lord all of his life. She'll turn him over to the priest and enroll him in the tabernacle ministry. Second, she promises God, if you give me a baby boy, I'll see to it that he becomes a Nazirite for life. You see, being a Nazirite was like being a walking billboard for God. The most spiritual and godly people were the people who took the Nazirite vow. And so, in verse 20 of chapter 1, guess what? She had a baby. God answered her prayer. Samuel was born. And Samuel judged Israel for many years. And finally, when he became old, they told him, "You're now old and your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations around us have." Now, all people, Americans, should understand it was not a good idea for Israel to appoint a king. America itself was born out of outrage over the King of England's abuse of power. So of all people, we understand what could go wrong here. But Israel wanted to be like their neighbor nations. Rather than having faith in the invisible God, they wanted a visible ruler that they could see and could inspire them and could lead them into battle and make their decisions and choices for them. And God had told them, you don't want this. You think you want this. Have you ever as a parent told your kids, all right, you think you want this. I'm telling you, you don't want this. But they begged. Sometime at some point you gave in. And sure enough, before long they didn't want it. That's what's happening here. God has told his children of Israel over and over again, I'm telling you, you don't want this. If you appoint a king will sometimes turn you into his slaves. He will make you work to build him a palace. He will make you work to provide him gold. He will tax and tax and tax you. But they wouldn't listen. From the outset, God wanted to be Israel's only king. His ideal form of government was a theocracy, rather than a monarchy through a king. He told them about the abuses of kings. He said, you will regret this again and again. But they would not listen. And so finally the Lord said to Samuel, do as they say and give them a king. And Samuel agreed and sent the people home. Now understand, the evil of big government is about to enter Israel. Big government has almost never been a good thing anywhere because it's controlled by big people who will abuse power in a big way. When God was king, government was simple and streamlined. God would appoint a judge from time to time, but generally speaking, he was enough. but with any form of human government except bureaucracy and lots of it, the king will expect the citizens to serve him instead of the king serving the citizens. Have you ever known of an instance where that did not become true? No, not really. Because someone said power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. History records the reign of a handful of very benevolent dictators, which, by the way, might actually be the best form of government. But no man is really hardly capable of being a benevolent dictator. It's almost an oxymoron. It really is. It's difficult for a good man to handle that kind of power and authority as a king. God knew that, but he's going to let him have one. And so here's what happened. Over the next 500 years, there will be 42 kings that will rule over either the United Kingdom or the divided kingdom of the northern and the southern kingdom. 42 kings over the next 500 years before Israel is taken into captivity. You know how many of those 42 could even be considered kind of good? Not great or spiritual, just kind of good? 9. 9 will earn a positive approval rating in God's poll. And so Samuel says, all right, God's going to let you have your king. God tells him to await the arrival of a tall, young Benjamite man and then anoint him as king. And after Saul is anointed king, he immediately leads a very successful battle against the Ammonites and is publicly confirmed as the king of Israel, the first king of Israel at Gilgal. And the beginning of Saul's 42-year reign, the beginning 10 years, very positive. But it soon turns into just exactly what God had warned them of, a dreadful disappointment. And it was so unnecessary. Saul regularly disobeys God by taking spoils of war from defeated people, and then he pathetically tries to rationalize his disobedience away. And Samuel's not buying it because God's not buying it either. So they go into battle against the Amalekites, who's led by King Agag, and God has specifically told Saul, don't take anything. Don't take livestock, don't take prisoners, don't take the king, don't take anything. These people, the Amalekites, are people who will destroy you. They will bring their idol worship and their heathen paganistic views into Israel, and they will destroy you, as happened later in history. And so utterly destroy them. And so Saul didn't. He spared the king's life. He kept the best of the sheep and the goats and the cattle and the fat calves and the lambs, everything. In fact, there's the key word, everything that appealed to them. They destroyed only what was worthless or of poor quality. So he keeps King Agag as a trophy when he was told not to, and he holds on to everything that appeals to them, certainly the best of the herds, for a reward of a job well done. He must have figured, hey, why waste a good barbecue, you know? But the thing displeased the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, I'm sorry that I ever made Saul king, for he's not been loyal to me and he has refused to obey my command. And Samuel was so deeply moved when he heard this that he cried out to the Lord all night. What sad words for God to say, I'm sorry that I ever set you up as the king. I'm sorry that I ever set you up as the preacher. I'm sorry I ever set you up as one of the elders. I'm sorry I ever set you up as one of the Bible teachers. I'm sorry I ever gave you the beauty and the blessing of being a parent. What a sad thing for God to have said. And so Samuel went and told Saul that, and I want you to notice, Saul had to be a quick thinker, I'm telling you, give him that. Saul's justification and rationalization for it. He said, well, it's true that we spared the best of the sheep and the goats and the cattle, but we were going to sacrifice them to the Lord your God. We destroyed everything else. We plan to use these animals as sacrifices. Well, you got to give him credit for quick thinking anyway. Was he also going to sacrifice the king? But still quick thinking, as if God would be pleased with that illegal contraband as a sacrifice. It would be a little bit like us this morning pouring moonshine into the communion cups and saying, well, Lord, we didn't want to waste all this good moonshine. That'd be exactly what it would be like. And so his rationalization and his justification went nowhere with Samuel, who then says what are the probably most familiar verses in this book. What is more pleasing to the Lord? Your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than the offering of the fat of rams. Saul, even if he was telling the truth, I don't believe he was, had confused sacrifice with obedience. A lot of people do. A lot of people do. Folks assume you can do as you please as long as you throw God a bone. They figure God can be pacified or bought off or just offer him some kind of suitable sacrifice. But according to these two verses, they don't know God. God doesn't care about our sacrifices. He cares about our heart. And we're going to see that in a big way in just a minute when Israel's second king is chosen. And the reason that he does is because God grades on a different scale. And it's easy for us to think, or for Saul to think, well, I'm not a diabolical person. I'm not into witchcraft. There aren't any idols sitting on my mantle. But rebellion to God is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as idolatry. So I mentioned a moment ago, up to this point, Saul has been king for about 10 years, and he's done a good job, and things have gone pretty well. He will still remain king for 30 more years. But this passage says that God removes his spirit from Saul, and as a result, absolutely nothing productive will happen in the life of Saul or to the Israelites for 30 years. Virtually nothing will happen because God says rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft and stubbornness as bad as worshiping idols. And you rejected the command of the Lord your God. And so keep in mind, in God's eyes, Saul is already not king. Oh, he's still sitting on the throne. The people still view him as that, but God's moved on. He's choosing the successor. And he tells Samuel, I want you to go out to a farmland where a man named Jesse owns a large farm and has several sons. And Israel's new king I will identify to you, and it's going to be one of Jesse's sons. You've mourned long enough for Saul. I have rejected him as king of Israel. Find a man named Jesse who lives there, for I have selected one of his sons to be my king. And in verse 6, the sons arrive as sort of a lineup. There are 7 of them that arrive in this lineup. And the first one, apparently they're kind of like when we do a wedding. You know, we line everybody up in order according to height. Apparently it's kind of like that because the tallest one is in the front of the line. His name is Eliab. And when they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. He must have been strong. He must have been handsome. He must have been tall. But see, that's exactly what they all said of Saul. Once again, a king is about to be chosen for all the wrong reasons. Samuel is looking only as far as his eyes can see. So I was reading an article not too long ago because, we've been in a building boom here with homes being built and that kind of thing. And I was reading an article. It was very interesting. Construction experts claim that today's home buyers use the absolutely wrong criteria when they are searching for a house. They agonize over all the wrong features. They spend a lot of time, they go in and look at a new home, and they spend a lot of time looking at the size of the bathtub and the width of the crown molding and all sorts of things like that they could see, rather than the stuff that's really important. They said the question you really ought to ask is, what is the size of the floor joists? What is the strength of the foundation? The stuff you cannot see matters the most in home construction, and particularly in the long run. And this article said usually home buyers then make their decisions on the absolute wrong elements, surface elements. They want a home with flash and splash. And that may be how people choose a home, and it may be how people choose a politician, a president, or a king, but it is not the way God chooses a servant. He looks at foundational issues. Man looks at appearance. God looks at substance. And so Samuel said to Jesse, as they went through the lineup of 7 sons, "Is this all your sons?" And he said, "No, there's one more." And he's tending sheep out in the field. He's the youngest. We believe David was about 15 years old. Tending sheep out in the field. He's the youngest. Samuel said, "Send for him, because don't judge by his appearance or height," the Lord said. "I have rejected him." The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Boy, is that not true? Is that not true? We do. We're impressed by beauty, size, intelligence, maybe even con. The Lord's looking at the heart. And so, it's interesting. He sent for David, and he wants a man after his own heart, we're going to see in just a moment, rather than just somebody's appearance. I want to park there for just a half a second and say God just does not care about a person's appearance. We do, but we shouldn't. The color of one's skin, the cut of one's clothes, the cut of the hair, the height or lack thereof. In one of Arthur Conan Doyle's novels, the hero Sherlock Holmes made this statement: "The most winning woman I ever knew was hanged for poisoning 3 little children for their insurance money. And the most repellent man of my acquaintance is a philanthropist who has spent nearly $250,000 upon the London poor." Good example about what the Lord is saying here to Samuel. There was a book a few years ago called The Faces of Greatness, The Faces of Greatness. And it contained the up-close photographs of 90 famous people. And of the 90 faces, 70 have very noticeable blemishes. 35 have moles or warts on their face. 13 have multiple freckles or liver spots, 20 have obvious acne or pimples, and 2 have highly visible scars. Yet each one of those 70 people overcame a flawed appearance by having a courageous heart. Our job is to represent God, not our own biases. And sometimes God may use people who just don't fit the mold or look the part to remind us that His qualifications are completely different from ours. He's out in the fields watching the sheep and goats. Send for him at once, Samuel says. We will not sit down to eat until he arrives. Samuel realizes this is it. This is going to be the guy because God told me I'm going to choose from one of Jesse's sons, and I've already been through all of them but this one. So Samuel says, we're not going to sit down until he eats. So Jesse sent for him, and he was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. Wouldn't you ladies love to have seen him? And the Lord said, this is the one. Anoint him. And so David is anointed privately. He's going to be anointed 3 times as king of Israel. This is the first time privately. Saul, the current king, doesn't even know about it. And David does not have any time whatsoever to relax as the future king. He immediately is going to face a giant issue, a really giant issue. The very next chapter, the Philistines and the Israelites are ready to do battle. And Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel, and he was over 9 feet tall. So, we can't really relate to 9 feet tall. The tallest person I have ever seen is a guy named Manute Bol, who played in the NBA back in the 90s, I think it was, who was 7'7.5". And I actually went to a game where he was playing, and I got within maybe 50 feet of him and that kind of thing. Man, he was tall. So take another 1.5 feet on top of Manute Bol. That was Goliath. And Goliath not only had size, but he had a mouth. He talked smack. He was a big trash talker. He stood and shouted a taunt across the Israelites. Why are you all coming out to fight? I am the Philistine champion, and you're the only servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. Now, understand what's happening here. This was not unusual. Ancient warfare was hand-to-hand combat. It wasn't like war today where some guy's sitting in an air-conditioned office pushing a button and a bomb goes off several thousand miles away. Ancient warfare was bloody and brutal. Even the victorious army suffered often thousands of casualties. So often, rather than fight a battle, armies would send out a champion warrior from each side to fight a winner-take-all battle that would conquer a small piece of land or would make people subservient but not fully subservient, so that they saved hundreds and thousands of lives. And so that's what's happening here. And Goliath has come out and issued that challenge. And he says, send somebody out, a champion warrior, to fight me. Now, anybody know who the tallest man who was supposed to be the champion warrior in Israel was? You do, Saul. The king didn't come close to matching Goliath in size, but the king was the one who came the closest to matching. Saul physically was the closest to matching him. But spiritually speaking, he was a midget, a coward. In fact, you're going to see that he was as terrified as everybody else. Have you seen the giant the men asked? He comes out each day to defy Israel. And Saul has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife. and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes. That's a pretty big reward that's being offered there. I'm telling you right now, you offered me not to pay taxes just the rest of my short life that's left. I'd probably take that kind of deal. So he's offering a threefold reward to the man who defeats Goliath. Great riches, his daughter in marriage, and perhaps the most attractive perk of all, lifetime tax exemption for the man's whole family. That's quite a windfall. Yet nobody is courageous enough or faithful enough to step out and take on Goliath. Look, we are all, before I read the next few verses, I want to tell you this because most people miss this. Most people have missed this in this story. For 20 years or so, I missed this in this story. And then about 15, 20 years ago, I found it. And it was impactful to me. It was profound to me. Because if you don't know this part, it's going to stun you. Most of us are reward motivated. I think the Christian life is the best life, don't misunderstand me, but I really have obeyed and loved and served God because I want to spend eternity in heaven. Right? I'm reward motivated that way. And so these three rewards have been offered now. Now, David has been sent by his father to the battlefield. David has been out in the shepherd's field again, but all of his brothers are in the battle. And so David has been sent with a package of fruits and vegetables and gifts to take to a care package to take to his brothers. And he is standing nearby listening to all this. And he asked the soldier standing nearby, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending the defiance of Israel?" Wait a minute, what did you say? He's going to get what? He's going to get riches, the king's daughter in marriage, which means be a part of the king's court and family, and his whole family exempt from taxes. Notice that's the first thing he asked. He's asking about the reward. And then he says, who is this pagan Philistine anyway that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God? I mean, we're all reward motivated, my friends, in some way. And so David hears it. Then he asks for verification, right? Well, it ticks his older brother Eliab. You remember the first one Samuel saw, and Samuel thought this has got to be the one. It ticks him off. And he was angry and he said, "What are you doing around here anyway? What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle." His own brother accuses him of being a show-off. He's just grandstanding. No, the truth is, he was jealous of his younger brother's courage and faith and stepping up. It's sad when your own brother tries to douse your faith. It's sad when somebody in your own family tries to put out your fire. You see, at times the biggest opposition to faith is not the scorn of the enemy, but the skepticism of a friend or family member. But then notice what happens next. David doesn't even, I love David's response, doesn't even address his brother. Doesn't even address him. I love that. I've tried to learn from that. People are always going to criticize you. It's fine, have your criticism. It's not going to bother what I do or what I think or how I'm going to go. I want to listen to my critics because your critics will tell you things that your friends and family won't always tell you. So I want to listen to my critics and I want to evaluate their criticism carefully. But then if I think it's invalid, as this criticism was invalid, I'm not going to stand there and argue with my critics all day. I'm just not. And so he moves on. But notice what he moves on to do. He walked over to some others and asked them the same thing. What's the same thing? What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? So he's heard it, his own ears, And he now twice has asked it. And he's told again, yeah, that's what's going to happen. You'll get the king's daughter in marriage, you'll get riches, and you'll be tax exempt for the rest of your life. And then he says, don't worry about this Philistine, I'll go fight him. So Saul finally has a willing warrior. He sends for David, and David says, I'm going to fight him. And Saul says, don't be ridiculous. There's no way you can fight this Philistine. You're only a boy. And he's been a man of war since his youth. And Saul tries to give David his own armor, and David says, it doesn't fit. It's too big. I don't need that. I've done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from the Philistine too. Saul isn't brave enough to fight Goliath, but he wants to send his armor with David. But when David tries to suit up in it, Saul's armor doesn't fit him, just hangs all over him. David's just a kid, 15, 16 years old, which says this to me. When God calls you to fight with something you know will work. Don't trust in somebody else's program. Don't trust in somebody else's gimmick. Don't trust in somebody else's armor. When you're up against a giant in your life, you don't suddenly start looking for different tactics and techniques and armor. Faith rests on what it knows is true. It doesn't canvass all the self-help stores for the newest and the latest of how to figure out and handle the war or the battle. David trusts in what is tried and tested and true. He said a simple slingshot killed bears and lions, and it'll drop a giant if it would drop a bear. And so he's going to fight clothed in faith. But I want you to notice this, just throwing this in for free because I like it. He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them in his shepherd's bag, and armed with only his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Now, this is something else I didn't know until about 15 or 20 years ago that I just missed and passed through. I didn't think there was any significance to picking up the 5 smooth stones. I mean, why did he pick up 5 stones? Did he think he was going to miss 4 times? I mean, is that what was going on here? No, that's not what's going on at all. We learn over in 2 Samuel chapter 21 that Goliath had 4 giant brothers. They were giants too. Evidently, David wanted to be ready for all 4 of them if they jumped in to help their brother. Goliath sees David coming out, and he is not impressed at all. Am I a dog that you come out at me with a stick, a slingshot? And he cursed David by the names of his gods. Come over here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals. David, on the other hand, was not the least bit intimidated, as had all the Israelite soldiers been, and Saul had been. Saul was fearful too. And he said, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I'm going to kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel, and everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. And then that verse that was a beautiful hymn that we sing that I love so much, in heavenly armor will enter the land, the battle belongs to the Lord. That song comes from this verse. This is the Lord's battle. The battle belongs to the Lord, and he will give you to us. David took aim, twirled his swing, slung the stone through the air, And I don't think it was just that David was a good shot, though he had been practicing out in those shepherds' fields. I think it was more than that. I believe God took over the trajectory of that rock to ensure that it landed right between the two eyeballs and hit in just the right place to make Goliath die instantly and fall to the ground. I think Goliath probably didn't know what hit him. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the head. The stone sank in and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. And then David ran over, pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath. Remember what David had told him he was going to do to him? He did it. He did it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and ran. The camp of Israel was supercharged by David's stunning upset. Maybe the greatest upset of all time. And the Philistines were deflated. And the Hebrew rout was on as they rushed after the Philistines and killed them as far as to Gath and Ekron, pretty far inland, if you know the area. So now the victory has captured all of Israel's attention. And the adulation over David's heroism has grown immensely. Saul makes him a member of his court. From that day, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. David played music, particularly the harp. He wrote songs. He made Saul feel good. Whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him a commander over the men of war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. Everything is just peachy keen. Everything is just hunky-dory for a few days. And when the victorious Israelite army was returning home, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul and sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals. And this was their song: Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Now, that didn't sit very well with Saul. That made Saul very angry. What's this? He said. They credit David with tens thousands and me with only thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king. Poor man didn't know God already had. Didn't even know it. And here's the key statement. From that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Jealousy can drive us to do terrible things we would otherwise never do. In the next few chapters in 1 Samuel, David's positive reputation continues to grow, as does Saul's jealousy, to where David has to actually flee Saul's court, go out into the wilderness in order to try to not be murdered by Saul. Saul later can't get a hold of Samuel because he's dead, and he decides to go to a witch in Endor. And the witch tells him, "You are going to go down in battle tomorrow." And he indeed does in the last chapter of 1 Samuel. And he was wounded, but as he's lying on the ground, he begs his sword bearer to kill him. His sword bearer is afraid and won't do it. And so he took his own sword and fell on it. What a cowardly and tragic ending for Israel's first king. So I guess my question today would be, and there's a lot that we could gather from this book of 1 Samuel, but the biggest question I would have for you is this: what is your Goliath? What is your Goliath? What is your giant? Whatever it is, God can help you defeat it if you act with faith and courage, just like he helped a 15, 16-year-old teenage boy.